What kind of woman drives her husband hours from home, leaves him stranded, and still swears she was the victim? That woman was me. I thought I was teaching him a lesson, but when the lesson came back through lawyers and court orders, I realized too late who'd really been learning. I'm Clarabelle Doran, 32, and I still don't understand how I became the villain in a story that started as a joke. I used to think I was clever, smarter than the quiet man I married, sharper than the dull life we built. Nathan was steady to a fault, the kind of man who made lists for everything, even groceries. I used to tease him for it, saying he'd probably schedule emotions if he could. He'd just smile, like my cruelty was something gentle. I mistook that for weakness. We'd been married 7 years when I started telling people I felt invisible. It sounded better than saying bored. I told my friend Tessa that Nathan's calm was driving me insane. She said maybe I needed a little chaos to remind myself I was still alive. That's how it started. Not with a plan, but with a suggestion I wanted to prove right. At work, there was this mechanic in the parking garage named Jace. He'd always wink when I drove in, complimenting my hair, my laugh, whatever he thought would land that day. I told myself it was harmless. Nathan didn't notice or didn't care, and that somehow made it worse. He never questioned where I went, what I wore, who I texted. He just assumed the best of me. I started to resent that. When I got home late, Nathan would ask if I'd eaten. I'd tell him I was working late, and he'd nod, believing every word. I'd complain to Tessa that he was too trusting, too passive, that he made me feel like I could get away with anything. She laughed and said maybe I should test that theory. I laughed too, but the idea stayed. I told myself I just wanted to shake things up, to make Nathan notice me again. But really, I wanted to feel powerful, to see if I could pull the strings and still keep the perfect picture intact. And once I started pulling, I couldn't stop. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The thing about routine is it makes you feel safe until it starts to choke you. That's how it felt living with Nathan. Every morning was the same, the kettle whistling, the sound of his footsteps in the hall, the careful way he folded his tie before work. I used to find that comforting. Now it just felt like watching a man rehearse his own dullness. He never forgot anything, never raised his voice, never said no. I told myself I wanted passion, not politeness. He said he was grateful for stability. I started to hate that word. We lived in a neat duplex on a quiet street, the kind of place with trimmed hedges and neighbors who smiled too much. Nathan loved it, said it was the kind of home you could grow old in. I'd look around at the beige walls and think, God, I hope not. When I complained, he'd tell me I was restless, that things didn't have to be exciting to be good. I'd roll my eyes and say he sounded like a retirement brochure. At first, I kept my frustration to myself, but then I started telling Tessa. She was my best friend, the one who said everything out loud that I only thought. She'd listen while scrolling through her phone, nodding and saying things like, "Girl, you need some fun. He's turned you into wallpaper." I laughed, pretending she was exaggerating, but her words stuck. I began to wonder if I had faded into the background of my own life. That's when Jace appeared, or rather, when I started noticing him. He worked in the parking garage next to my office, always covered in grease, always smiling, like he knew something about me that I didn't. One morning, my car wouldn't start, and he offered to look at it. He said, "Your husband doesn't keep up with maintenance." I told him Nathan was more of a spreadsheet kind of guy, not a hands-on one. Jace laughed and said, "Figures." It was such a small thing, but it made me feel like someone was finally on my side. After that, I made excuses to see him. Sometimes I'd forget my parking ticket, just so I'd have to walk back to his booth. He'd tease me about it, and I'd say it wasn't my fault, that I was distracted. He said, maybe your life's too predictable. I told him maybe he was right. It wasn't flirting, not really, just banter. At least that's what I told myself. At home, Nathan started noticing I was distracted. He'd ask if something was wrong, if work was stressful. I said I was fine. He'd smile softly and say, "You know you can tell me anything." That made me angry for reasons I couldn't explain. I didn't want to tell him anything. I wanted him to notice without being told. One Friday night, after dinner, he suggested we watch a movie together. Something light, he said, to relax. I told him I was tired, that I had an early morning. He offered to clean up alone, as always, and I let him. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone, staring at Jace's messages. They were harmless. Things like, "You looked stressed today," or "Don't forget to smile." But they felt like sparks in a room full of dust. The next morning, I went for coffee with Tessa and told her about Jace. She raised her eyebrows and said, "Finally, someone interesting." I said it wasn't like that I just liked talking to him. She smirked and said, "You're allowed to talk, but don't pretend you don't like the attention." I laughed because she was right. I did like it. It made me feel alive, wanted, seen. All the things Nathan's steady love no longer gave me. That weekend, Nathan tried to plan a small family picnic with Ellie. He packed sandwiches, brought her favorite juice boxes, even remembered sunscreen. I should have appreciated it, but instead, I kept checking my phone, hoping for a message that never came. When Nathan noticed, he asked who I was texting. I told him it was Tessa. He said okay, and that word irritated me more than if he'd accused me of lying. Just okay. Always okay. That night, while he read Ellie a bedtime story, I watched them from the doorway. They looked peaceful together, safe. I should have felt proud of the family we'd built. Instead, I felt trapped inside it. When he kissed me goodnight later, I turned my head so his lips brushed my cheek instead. He paused but didn't say anything. I waited for him to push back, to argue, to care. He didn't. The next day, I told Tessa I was thinking about doing something reckless, just to see if Nathan would finally react. She grinned and said, "Do it. Some people only wake up when they lose control." I laughed and said, maybe I'd test that theory. But inside, I was already making plans. The next few weeks blurred together, though I remember every lie I told. They started small, little things I said just to see if Nathan would notice. I'd say I was staying late at work when I wasn't, or that I was meeting Tessa for coffee when I was really sitting in my car messaging Jace. Each time Nathan asked how my day was, I'd give him the same vague answer. Busy but fine. He always smiled, always believed me. His trust stopped feeling sweet and started feeling stupid. Jace kept slipping into my routine like it was the most natural thing in the world. He'd meet me near the cafe downstairs from the office, bring me coffee, tease me about how serious I looked. He'd say, "You're too young to already act like you're 40. I'd roll my eyes and tell him he had no idea how dull things could get. One afternoon, when I mentioned Nathan's name, Jace shrugged and said, "If he doesn't make you happy, why are you still there?" I told him marriage wasn't something you just quit. He laughed and said, "Sure it is. People quit things all the time when they stop working." That line stuck with me longer than it should have. At home, I started treating Nathan differently. Not in big ways, just small cuts he didn't seem to notice. I'd correct him in front of Ellie when he mixed up a word. I'd roll my eyes when he explained something too slowly. He'd ask if something was wrong, and I'd say, "I'm fine, just tired." Then I'd go to bed early, pretending to sleep. Most nights I'd lie awake scrolling through messages, waiting for Jace's name to pop up. When it didn't, I'd feel restless, angry, and somehow it was Nathan's fault. Marlene came by one afternoon to drop off a sweater she'd knitted for Ellie. She was kind, polite, but I always felt like she was watching me. She asked how things were between me and Nathan, and I said we were fine. She smiled, that knowing kind of smile that older women have, and said, "Fine is usually where trouble starts." I laughed it off, but her words lingered. That weekend, Nathan suggested we drive up to his mother's house for Sunday dinner. I didn't want to go. He said it had been months since we'd visited, and that Ellie missed her grandmother. I sighed and agreed, already planning to leave early. At the table, Marlene made small talk while Nathan helped Ellie cut her food. She asked about work, and I told her it was busy. She said she'd heard I'd been out late a lot lately. I froze for half a second, then smiled. That's just office stuff. Nathan knows how demanding my boss is. Nathan looked up but didn't say a word. I hated that he let me lie so easily. Later that night, after Ellie went to bed, Nathan asked if something had changed between us. He said he felt like I was pulling away. I told him I wasn't, that he was imagining things. He said maybe we could take a weekend trip, just the two of us, to reconnect. I said we didn't need to fix anything, that I was happy. He smiled faintly and said, "You keep saying that, but you don't look it." I laughed, said he was overthinking, and turned off the light. The next morning, I told Tessa about it. She said, "He's starting to feel you slipping away. That's when men either cling harder or crumble." I said Nathan wasn't the clinging type. She grinned and said, "Then you've already won." That word, won, made me feel strong, like this was a game I could control. The following week, Jay started pushing boundaries. He'd text late at night, small things like, "Can't sleep, thinking of you." The first time, I ignored it. The second time, I wrote back, "You shouldn't say things like that." He replied, "Why not, if it's true?" My heart raced, not from guilt but from the thrill of being wanted. At dinner that week, Nathan asked why I'd been smiling at my phone. I said Tessa had sent a meme. He nodded, looking tired, older somehow. I noticed he'd lost weight. Probably stress, though I told myself he'd been skipping meals out of laziness. When he reached for my hand across the table, I pulled away to grab my glass instead. He noticed. He always noticed, but never said anything. That night, I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, staring at our reflection. Him in the doorway, me pretending not to care. He asked softly if I was happy being with him. I said yes, too quickly. He smiled a little and said, "Then why do you look like you're somewhere else?" I didn't answer. I just walked past him, turned off the light and left him standing there. In bed, I texted Jace, "You up?" He replied instantly, "Always for you." I should have stopped, but I didn't. And when Nathan whispered goodnight beside me, I didn't reply. I was too busy pretending someone else was listening. The trip was Nathan's idea, though I told everyone it was mine. He said we needed time away from work and noise, a few hours just to breathe. I agreed because it sounded like a chance to prove something, that I could still pretend to care. Besides, I already had my own plan for that day. Jace was supposed to be in town, waiting. I'd told him I could slip away for a few hours if I played things right. Nathan woke early, cheerful in that quiet way he had. He packed snacks, filled the tank, even double-checked the weather. I watched him move around the kitchen and felt irritated by his calm. When he asked if I wanted to drive, I said, sure, mostly because I wanted control. We got on the highway just after sunrise. The car was filled with small talk that felt like acting. He asked about my projects at work, and I gave half answers. I asked about his route schedule, pretending to listen. About an hour into the drive, he reached over and squeezed my hand. It startled me more than it should have. He said he was glad we were spending time together again. I smiled, but my mind was already elsewhere. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, a text from Jace asking if I'd still meet him later. Nathan glanced at the phone, then back at the road. "Everything okay?" he asked. I said it was just Tessa, nothing important. We stopped at a gas station near a small town. Nathan offered to get drinks. While he was inside, I checked my messages. Jace had sent the name of a motel and a room number. My pulse jumped. It wasn't supposed to feel like guilt. It was supposed to feel like freedom. When Nathan came back, I tucked my phone away and smiled too brightly. As we drove farther, I started thinking about how to pull it off. Jace was only 30 minutes from where we were. I could drop Nathan somewhere, make up a reason, then circle back later. The thought came so easily it scared me a little. But once it was there, I couldn't let it go. Nathan noticed I'd gone quiet. He asked if something was wrong, if I was tired. I said I just needed some air, maybe a short walk when we stopped next. He nodded, no suspicion in his eyes. When we reached a rest stop by the woods, I pulled over. The parking lot was nearly empty. I told him I needed a minute to clear my head. He said okay and stepped out, stretching his legs. I told him I'd drive up ahead to find better reception, that I'd be right back. He nodded, trusting as always. I watched him in the mirror as I pulled away. Standing by the trees, hands in his pockets, looking around for a moment before turning toward the path. I told myself it was fine, that I'd only be gone an hour or two, that he'd wait like he always did. But as I drove away, a strange thrill mixed with dread. My phone kept buzzing. Jace asking when I'd arrive. By the time I reached the motel, the idea of Nathan still waiting felt unreal, like something happening to someone else. Jace greeted me in the parking lot, casual and smiling. He said, "You actually did it." I laughed too loudly and said, "Don't make it sound dramatic." We got coffee, talked, pretended this was something exciting instead of pathetic. But when he left for work a few hours later, the silence hit me. My phone was full of missed calls. All from Nathan. Dozens of them. I didn't answer. I told myself he'd overreacted, that he'd probably walked to a nearby diner or called for a ride. I even posted a picture of my coffee to make it look like a normal day. When Tessa texted asking how the trip was going, I said, "Peaceful. He's getting some exercise." I laughed at my own joke and hated how cruel it sounded even in my head. By the time I drove home, the sun was already setting. Nathan wasn't there. His truck wasn't in the driveway. I waited an hour, then 2. Finally, around midnight, the door opened. He came in quietly, shoes muddy, face pale. I asked where he'd been, trying to sound annoyed instead of scared. He said he'd walked. "All the way?" I asked. He nodded once. "You left me 30 miles out," he said softly. "The least I could do was come home." I started to apologize, but the words tangled. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He just said, "Don't worry, I understand now," and went to the guest room. I didn't sleep that night. His calm terrified me more than any anger ever could. The next morning felt strange, too quiet, like the house itself was waiting for something. Nathan was already gone when I woke up. The coffee pot was still warm, and the kitchen looked untouched. I told myself he just needed to cool off, that he'd get over it. But the calmness in his voice the night before replayed in my head, steady and unreadable. I understand now. It didn't sound like forgiveness. It sounded like a decision. When Tessa came by later, I told her what happened, but I twisted the story. I said Nathan had thrown a fit on the drive, that he'd gotten out of the car on his own because he needed space. I made it sound funny, like something out of a sitcom. She laughed at first, then hesitated. "You actually left him there?" she asked. I said it wasn't like that I'd come back eventually. She raised an eyebrow and said, "You came back home instead." I shrugged, pretending not to care. "He walked, didn't he?" I said. "He's fine." When Nathan came home that evening, he didn't say a word to me. He showered, ate, and sat at the table with Ellie, helping her with her math homework. They both acted like I wasn't there. I tried making small talk, but he didn't respond beyond a quiet yes or no. The silence crawled under my skin. When Ellie went to bed, I finally asked if we were going to talk about what happened. He said calmly, "There's nothing left to talk about." That was the first night he didn't sleep in our bed. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. The next morning, I found his pillow and a folded blanket on the couch. I told myself it was temporary. But when I looked in the laundry basket later that week, none of his clothes were there. That's when I realized he'd started washing them somewhere else. A few days later, Marlene showed up unannounced. She had that same expression she always wore around me. Polite, distant, faintly disappointed. She said Nathan had stopped by her house the day after the trip. I tried to sound casual, asked what he said. She replied, he didn't say much, just that he'd been thinking clearly for the first time in years. Her words stung more than I expected. I asked if she came to take his side. She said, I didn't need to. You gave him a reason all by yourself. After she left, I started feeling everyone's eyes on me. Neighbors, co-workers, even family. People must have talked. Maybe Nathan had told someone, or maybe word spread on its own. My parents called, asking if everything was okay. I said Nathan was being distant, that he'd taken something small and made it huge. They said maybe I should apologize. I laughed it off, said he was being dramatic, but inside, I could feel something shifting. At work, Jace noticed my mood. He said, you look like you haven't slept. I told him things at home were tense. He said, that's what happens when you marry the wrong man. I asked if he'd ever been married. He said no, and that he was smart enough not to be. It wasn't charming anymore. The next day, he stopped texting as much. I could tell he'd lost interest now that the game wasn't fun. When I got home one evening, Nathan was in the living room with a folder open in front of him. I asked what he was doing. He said he was getting his documents in order. I laughed and said, for what? He said, for what comes next. That was all. His voice was calm, not cold. That made it worse. That night, I looked through our shared accounts online. 2 of them were missing. The joint savings was nearly empty. The balance moved to another account under his name. I confronted him the next morning. He didn't deny it. He said, you made choices. I'm just following through. I told him he couldn't just take money without asking. He said, you left me on the side of the road without asking. This feels fair. I told Tessa, hoping she'd back me up, but she only said, Clara, maybe he's done playing nice. I snapped at her, said she didn't understand. But later, alone in the kitchen, I realized she was right. Nathan wasn't reacting anymore. He was planning. A week later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Thick paper, no return address, just his name and mine typed neatly on the front. Inside was a formal notice, petition for dissolution of marriage. The words blurred as I read. It cited abandonment and emotional cruelty. My chest tightened. When Nathan came home that evening, I tried to stay calm. I said he didn't have to make this ugly, that we could work it out quietly. He said, you already made it ugly, Clarabel. I'm just making it legal. Then he walked past me, leaving me standing there in a house that suddenly didn't feel like mine. The mediation meeting took place 2 weeks later in a small beige office that smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee. I walked in dressed carefully. Neat blouse, soft makeup, polite smile. I wanted to look like the reasonable one, the composed wife holding everything together while her husband unraveled. Nathan was already there, sitting across the table, his lawyer beside him. He looked rested, even calm. It made me furious. The mediator explained the process, outlining finances, custody, and property division. I nodded, pretending to understand, waiting for Nathan to say something, anything. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to me. He addressed the mediator, explaining that he'd like full custody of Ellie for stability. The words hit me like a slap. I laughed quietly, said it wasn't realistic, that a child needs her mother. Nathan said, she needs peace more. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Then came the folder. His lawyer slid it across the table toward mine. Inside were documents, phone records, printed messages, time-stamped receipts. My chest went tight as I recognized some of the messages. Text to Jace, little ones I thought I'd deleted months ago. There were screenshots of my social media posts, including the one from the day I left Nathan on the road. The caption read, Sometimes you have to let people walk to find their pride. I remembered thinking it was clever at the time. Now it looked cruel. I said the messages were being taken out of context. Nathan didn't argue. He just said, "Context doesn't change truth." My lawyer whispered for me to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I said he was making a spectacle, turning a private issue into punishment. He said quietly, "You made it public when you laughed about it online." The mediator tried to move things along, asking about assets. Nathan had already separated his finances. The savings account, the house deed, even the car titles. Everything had been filed with careful notes. I realized he'd been preparing this for weeks, maybe months. Every time he'd sat in silence, he'd been planning. Every time I thought he was doing nothing, he'd been building a case. When the meeting ended, I followed him out into the hallway. I told him he didn't have to do this, that we could still fix things for Ellie's sake. He turned, his expression unreadable. "You think fixing things means pretending again," he said. "I'm done pretending." I went home that night replaying every conversation we'd ever had. The times he'd asked if I was happy, the times I'd lied, the times I'd laughed when he was trying to reach me. I still told myself he was overreacting, that he'd come to his senses eventually. But when a thick envelope arrived from his lawyer 3 days later, that illusion broke. It contained financial disclosures. He'd frozen the joint account and withdrawn his half legally, with receipts. There was a list of items he wanted to reclaim. Tools, documents, family photos. Nothing sentimental. Just clean, final things. Tessa came over that evening, bringing a bottle of wine like she always did when she didn't know what to say. She asked if I'd really left him stranded. I told her it wasn't that simple. She said, "It looks that simple from the outside." She sipped her wine and looked away when I started crying. "You always thought you could talk your way out of anything," she said quietly, "but maybe he finally learned to stop listening." The next mediation session was shorter. Nathan's lawyer presented more evidence, testimony from his cousin, who'd called him the night I drove off, security footage from a gas station showing him alone, trying to find a ride. It was humiliating to hear it all laid out like that. I said they were twisting the story. Nathan said, "You told it first." When we broke for lunch, I sat in the car outside the building, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't recognize the woman looking back, the tired eyes, the clenched jaw, the hollow confidence. For the first time, I realized this wasn't about who was right anymore. It was about who had proof. That evening, I called Nathan, desperate to speak without lawyers. He answered, but didn't say hello. I told him he didn't have to destroy me to move on. He said, "I'm not destroying you, Clarabelle. I'm letting you live with what you did." Then he hung up. When the phone screen went dark, I sat in silence, realizing what his quietness had always meant. It wasn't weakness. It was restraint. And now he was using it like a weapon I couldn't defend against. The final hearing was on a grey Monday morning, the kind of day where everything looked washed out. I arrived early, sitting in my car outside the courthouse, watching people go in and out. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I'd told myself I was prepared, that this was just paperwork, that Nathan would calm down once things were official. But deep down, I knew better. He wasn't angry anymore. He didn't need to be. He'd already won. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than I expected. Nathan sat with his lawyer at one table, neat and composed as always. Marlene was behind him, her posture straight, face calm. I avoided looking at her. My lawyer whispered something about strategy, but the words floated past me. When the judge entered, Nathan stood immediately. I followed a beat too late, already off rhythm. The proceedings were quick. My lawyer argued that I was a devoted mother, that my actions came from emotional strain. Nathan's lawyer countered with the evidence, the messages, the photos, the abandoned drive. They called it reckless disregard. I hated how calm they sounded, like they were reading weather reports instead of dissecting my life. Nathan spoke only once, to confirm that he'd made alternative living arrangements for Ellie. He said he wanted to protect her from instability. That word, instability, stuck in my throat like a stone. When the judge read the decision, it felt like the air went out of the room. Temporary custody to Nathan. The house to Nathan. Shared visitation rights pending review. My lawyer leaned toward me, murmuring something about appeals, but I didn't hear her. I was watching Nathan, the way he didn't even smile, didn't look triumphant, just relieved. That hurt more than anger would have. Relief meant he'd already mourned me long ago. Afterward, I tried to speak to him in the hallway. I said we could work something out privately, that we didn't have to involve so many people. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "You involved the whole world the day you made a joke out of me." I said it was one mistake, that he was ruining everything over pride. He said, "You left me 30 miles from home, Clarabelle. I'm just making sure you can't leave again." His voice didn't tremble, and that frightened me more than anything. When I left the courthouse, Marlene was standing by the doors. She didn't speak at first. Then, she said quietly, "You built your own silence, dear. Now you have to live in it." I wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that I never meant for things to go this far. But she just turned away and walked down the steps, her son and granddaughter waiting in the car below. I drove home alone. The house felt smaller somehow, even though nothing had changed. There were spaces where his things had been. The empty hook where he used to hang his jacket, the clear counter where his coffee mug had sat. I opened the fridge and found it half empty. Even the air smelled different. I kept expecting him to come back, to walk through the door and say this was all too much, that we could still fix it. But the only sound was the clock ticking. Later that afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up. The driver handed me a box and a clipboard to sign. Inside the box were the last of Nathan's belongings. A few books, a framed photo, and a note on plain paper. No hard feelings. Just distance. That was all it said. I stared at it until the words blurred. Tessa called that evening. I didn't want to answer, but I did. She asked what happened at court. I told her Nathan got everything. She was quiet for a while, then said, "He didn't get everything. You kept the guilt." I hung up before she could say more. That night I walked through each room, turning off the lights one by one. The silence felt like punishment, thick and heavy. I sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where I used to make jokes about how predictable he was, and realized I'd mistaken his quiet for weakness my entire marriage. It wasn't weakness, it was waiting. When I finally looked out the window, I saw Nathan's car parked across the street. He wasn't looking at me. He was helping Ellie into her seat, buckling her in with that same careful focus he'd always had. Then he drove away without glancing back. The sound of his engine faded down the road until there was nothing left but quiet. And for the first time, I understood what he'd meant that night when he said, "I understand now." It wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about peace, the kind you only get once you stop trying to be heard by someone who never listens. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.